A diagnosis of pancreatic cancer is tough all by itself, but our guest on this episode faced an additional obstacle, and his journey could have been more difficult, but he averted a potential second additional obstacle. He is Rob Caruano of New York City. This is the Cancer Interviews podcast, and I'm your host, Bruce Morton. Now it's time to hear Rob's story. And Rob, welcome to Cancer Interviews.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Rob, we'd like to do the same thing at the top of our interviews with everybody that we hear from, and that's to learn a little bit more about you, your life exclusive of cancer. So if you would, tell us a bit about where you're from, what you do for work, and what you do for fun.
Sure, absolutely. So Rob Caruano, I grew up in Pennsylvania, but have been in New York City now for over 20 years. My day job, ironically, is actually working as a cancer patient advocate for a pharmaceutical company. So what that means is I'm basically the company's representative to all of the nonprofit patient advocacy groups and the professional societies in various areas of cancer. In my case, it's mostly melanoma and lung cancer, so not professionally working in pancreatic cancer. And for fun, I love to travel and take advantage of all the great things New York City has to offer, especially the restaurants.
Now, we want to hear about this juncture that all of us who have survived cancer encountered at one time or another when you thought that your health was normal, and then you noticed something that seemed to be a bit abnormal. You had that checked out. That ultimately led to a diagnosis of cancer. So for you, how and when and where did that juncture manifest itself?
Yeah, so in December of 2021, just before Christmas, a few days before, I woke up in the middle of the night with a really bad, like an excruciating pain in what I thought was my stomach. It turned out that it was pancreatitis. I did not know what that was at the time, but that's what it was. And I went to urgent care the next morning because it was the middle of the night when the attack happened. So I went to urgent care the next morning. And this was right at the height of Omicron, the very first big Omicron variant, where all the healthcare system was overloaded again and was actually turned away from care there. So my journey was a little unique in that respect.
So how difficult, I already can tell that it was going to be difficult for you to be seen by a healthcare professional, but if you would describe what that difficulty was like and how you overcame it and were eventually seen.
Sure. So when I went to the clinic, they met us at the door and said that we're very sorry, we can see that you're in pain, but we cannot help you because we're overwhelmed with COVID. They said there were people in the hallways, there was nothing they could do. My only option was to go to an emergency room. And to be honest, in hindsight, I probably should have done that, but my concern was I would basically be turned away and sitting in there for many, many hours, and I was in too much pain to be able to deal with that. So I went back home. And I immediately got online. I'm part of one of these healthcare services that have many, many, many doctors. And I thought I would be able to get a quick appointment. I could not. They were also overwhelmed with COVID. So the first appointment I could get virtually was 2 days later. It was with a physician I never met, had no idea who it was, didn't care. I just made an appointment because I wanted to have something on the books to be able to talk about whatever this was that I was experiencing. So when I had that, when I finally did meet with that provider, he suggested that it was probably pancreatitis. He asked me to go get my blood tested, which I did that day. Had no expectation that my enzyme levels would be high at that point because it was several days later, but it was like 5 times above the normal range. So that confirmed that it was a pancreatic attack, and they assumed then, which was understandable, that it was a gallstone. Because the gallbladder throws a gallstone, it gets into your pancreatic duct and it causes the problem. So initially, I didn't have a lot of concern. I thought I had a gallstone. And he suggested that I get an ultrasound just to be safe. Again, because of COVID, it took 3 weeks just to get the appointment to be able to get in to have an ultrasound. So that ultrasound result showed a small, like 0.1 centimeter, however they measure it, dilation opening in my duct. And the doctor said something's not right because you wouldn't have a dilation in your pancreatic duct 3 weeks after a gallstone, that it would have moved by then. So he suggested that I get an MRI. So when I contacted the gastroenterologist to prescribe an MRI, he actually refused to do it. He insisted that I just have my gallbladder removed. And it was a very simple thing, happens all the time, just have your gallbladder removed, no big deal. And I had to argue with him to be able to get the MRI so I could really see what was going on inside my body. And we ultimately made a deal. He said, I'll prescribe the MRI if you agree to have your gallbladder removed and we schedule a surgery. I said, fine. So that's what we did. Had the MRI. That was the test that showed I had a mass in my pancreas, that he was wrong. He's the one who had to call me and tell me he was wrong. And while it wasn't an official diagnosis at that point, I still had to have the biopsy. It was pretty clear at that point that it was pancreatic cancer. So by the time I actually got diagnosed, it was 3 or 4 months after my original symptoms. So it took a long time. So I had all these different tests that had to happen, and every one of them was delayed because of COVID. And I was very concerned that it would spread by the time I actually got to whatever I needed to do.
By the way, we're confident you'll be able to learn some tips and tools to help you through your personal cancer journey. But first, we'd like to invite you to please give us a like, leave a comment or review below, and share this story with your friends. Kindly click on the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon. That way you'll be notified the next time we have an interview. And if you or a loved one are facing a cancer diagnosis, please click on the link in the description and show notes below to check out our free guide, The Top 10 Things I Wish I Knew When I First Got Cancer. Now, before we go on with more of your story, Rob, I want to circle back to a theme that we bring up from time to time on not all, but many of our interviews. We have learned thus far that it took a bit of self-advocacy on your part to get that MRI, and the MRI led to the diagnosis of cancer. If you would just expound a bit for anyone listening, regardless of whatever type of cancer they may have been diagnosed with the importance of self-advocacy.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, you have to be your best self-advocate. You have to listen to your body, and you have to be insistent. It's unfortunate that we have to do that, but we do. Because if I hadn't pushed for that MRI, I would have had a gallbladder removed. It would not have solved the problem. And by the time we realized what the problem was, I may not have been operable for my particular cancer. So I know some people are not comfortable doing it. I'll be honest, it's not the most comfortable thing for me to do, but I just really felt insistent that I needed to know what was going on. And I think everybody should do the same.
Now, anytime someone is diagnosed with cancer, it's a horrific event, horrific news. So we're not going to ask if it was horrific. We already know that. But different people will handle news of their diagnosis in a different way, which is why we ask in your case, how did you react to the news?
I was surprised because I have no family history, certainly not of pancreatic cancer, and not even of cancer in general. In my family, the big concern is heart disease and strokes and things like that. So that was always in the back of my mind, but cancer never really entered the picture. It was a little different in my case. The only positive side of taking so long to get the actual diagnosis is that it gave me several months to slowly ease into the idea, and one test after another started pointing more and more in that direction. So by the time I actually got the diagnosis, for me, it was almost confirmatory. It was not that shock that a lot of people get when they first hear the news because they got a test result back that they weren't expecting. I had a long process to finally get to that point. Not that it made it any easier. It was still difficult, particularly with pancreatic cancer. The assumption was that I was, pretty terminal at that point. But it was something that I had a little bit of time to slowly kind of ease into.
Now, following diagnosis comes treatment. So if you would fill us in on the type of treatment regimen that you underwent.
Yes. So initially when I was diagnosed, there was concern that I was metastatic, stage 4. It looked like the cancer had spread to my liver. I had spots on my liver. So there was an enormous amount of back and forth with 2 major health institutions, actually. And no one could figure out if these spots were cancerous or not by the imaging. They just couldn't tell. And these are very reputable, excellent institutions, and nobody could tell. So there was a period of time where it looked like I was not going to be operable, because if the cancer had spread to the liver, they won't operate. Ultimately, the institution where I received my care made the decision that they would wheel me in, open me up, and while I was on the operating table, manually inspect and see if the spots were cancerous. If they were, they would bring me back out. If they were not, they would proceed with the surgery. So thankfully, they were not cancerous, but it was a very stressful time not knowing all the way up to the last second, even if I would had the surgery or not. So I had a procedure. Many people with pancreatic cancer have a procedure called a Whipple procedure. You've probably discussed that in previous episodes. My procedure started out being a Whipple, and when they had me on the operating table, the surgeon realized that the tumor was kind of right on the borderline of where you could either take the head of the pancreas and do a Whipple procedure, which is standard, or take the other half of the pancreas, basically, which would be kind of the body and the tail. And thankfully, in my case, they made the decision to do the latter. So I didn't have a full Whipple procedure in the sense that they had to touch my stomach or intestines. Those were preserved. They took the other half of my pancreas, which involved removing the spleen and the gallbladder and most of the pancreas. So that was the surgical treatment. And then after surgery, I have a very, very rare, extremely rare, the 21st reported case of my particular type of pancreatic cancer. So there's no roadmap in terms of how to treat or how to deal with this. So we had a conversation with the providers and made the decision that to be extra safe, I would do chemotherapy to do everything possible to prevent recurrence. So I did 6 months of FOLFIRINOX, which is a multi-drug regimen of chemotherapy every other week.
And what was the most difficult part of that? Because we've learned from these interviews, Rob, that there's no such thing as a pleasant chemotherapy experience. Some people's experiences are more unpleasant than others. How difficult was yours? And what was the toughest part?
The toughest, but I had one single thing that was really tough for me, and it was the nausea. I had almost constant nausea for the whole time of the treatment. I never actually vomited. It could have been a lot worse. And if people have major problems and issues with vomiting and all kinds of things, I never actually vomited, but I always felt like I was going to. So I was very, very nauseous. We tried everything, all different kinds of combinations of things and tricks and tips, and nothing really worked until about 3/4 of the way through the chemotherapy. We tried one more thing. Which was Ativan, and that really did the trick. So I took that for the last couple of months of treatment, but up until then, just kind of made my way through it. But all things considered, I was otherwise very healthy and in really good shape, relatively young. So I was able to tolerate the regimen relatively well. I can't really complain about it.
Rob, we've already heard about how COVID asserted itself in terms of your ability to be seen. And then once you were seen, who saw you? But what about the treatment and post-treatment phase here? How was that affected by COVID?
Only to the extent that I was limited in terms of who could visit and support, because you could only have one person with you, if anyone. So that could be a little challenging, especially for my husband, who was the caregiver. He couldn't have anybody with him at any point in time, even during the surgery. For most of the surgery, we had our priest with us because they don't really count as a visitor, thankfully. But other than that, we couldn't have additional visitors. But generally speaking, COVID was, for me, only an issue in terms of getting the appointments that I needed to get, because there was such a backlog and such a delay with everything that everything was taking 3 weeks. The average was 3 weeks from every single appointment and procedure. It was 3 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks really started adding up over time. But otherwise, it wasn't as bad.
All right. Now, we brought up a theme a little bit earlier that we have brought up on previous interviews. And as we record this interview, we've done over 100 interviews. And I want to bring up a theme that has never surfaced, and I want to give us a chance to shine a metaphoric Klieg light on it. And that term is patient equity. Fill us in, enlighten us. What does it mean?
Yeah, so equity at its simplest form is basically ensuring that all people, regardless of their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all of that, have a fair shot at getting a really good or the best possible health outcomes. That's generally what health equity means. In my case, I'm part of the LGBT plus community, and that can mean many things. So I'll give you an example of, I was fortunate to be in an institution that actually did health equity quite well and really has a mind towards it, and people are trained and know how to do it. And in my case, all the right questions were asked up front. They asked about sexual orientation. They asked about gender identity. They asked about Are you married? To this, who is that? All the notes refer to my husband. And even things like we had a conversation when I was first diagnosed and we were making treatment decisions and we didn't know if I would survive or what kind of treatment ultimately might happen. There was conversation about fertility and, preserving fertility, and was that a concern or not a concern, or what do we want to do about it? They easily could have, we were middle-aged gay men with no children. That easily could have been assumed to not be a topic that has to be brought up, but they did. They did all of the right things. Unfortunately, most institutions don't do that. So I think I think things are getting better, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And that's just my story and being part of an LGBT community. When you talk about race, ethnicity, other factors, those also bring in a host of issues. People many times will make, it's not always conscious. Most of the time it's not conscious. It's an unconscious bias when providers are meeting with individuals. People of color are often assumed not to be able to be as adherent to a treatment, or may not have the right insurance to be able to afford a treatment. So automatically certain things are not even discussed or offered to a patient because of those preconceived notions about what he or she may be able to do or not to. So that's really what equity is getting at, and it's meant to help shine a light on this unconscious bias that people may have, educate them about how to appropriately work with people from different communities so that you're not making assumptions and inadvertently shutting doors or closing options for people that otherwise could benefit from it.
Rob, I'm just going to take a semi-educated guess here and say that this lack of patient equity, if you will, varies from facility to facility, and you could be even more specific and say that it varies from healthcare professional to healthcare professional.
100%.
What can be the source of addressing this situation and making it better, making it so it's not as bad as it apparently is in some situations?
The short answer is education and awareness. And it is shocking to me and to many that in medical school in 2023 or 2024, in our current time, there is basically no training provided to providers or future providers on how to do this right. I think that is a recognition of a gap in the current education. And there are probably medical schools that do it better than others and who do it and not do it. But generally speaking, most providers will tell you that when they went through medical school, this was not a topic and there is no training. So the training then becomes on the job. So an institution will provide, if you're in a good institution, may provide that kind of training that's needed. And then there's also, which is a little more challenging, some people have their own individual, biases, which can be difficult to overcome. There could be cultural issues with different races, with sexual orientation, with things like that, which are just ingrained in people, which I think are probably a little harder to overcome. But I think most providers and most people come at things from a well-intentioned point of view. They just do things less than in an ideal way because they may not be aware of the consequences of some of their actions or inactions for lack of training and awareness.
So, Rob, I'm wondering, and you may or may not know the answer to this question, but that's why I'm asking, who can educate the educators?
The people who are on the other side of the table. I think it's very helpful for providers to hear the patient perspective. The people who have been on the receiving end of some of the bad way that this happens. While I benefited from an institution through my cancer journey that did it right earlier in my life, I had many very negative experiences with healthcare providers who made all sorts of judgments and discriminatory comments in my care. So when that happens, you shut down, you close off, you don't share, you guard certain information, you keep things secret. That is not the key to good healthcare, because a provider needs to have open and honest conversation, and it needs to be a two-way conversation so that you can really work together as a team to make the best possible care choices. But I think having providers just be aware of the consequences of some of those things can make a big difference.
Now, I want to talk about a positive phase of your cancer journey, both past and present, and I hope future as well. And that is the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. If you would, tell us a bit about it. It's also known for short as PanCan. If you could tell us about what PanCan does and what it can do, what it's done for you and what it can do for others.
Yeah, so PanCan is a great organization. It's actually one of the first websites that I visited, pancan.org, just to first obtain information about pancreatic cancer. I knew nothing about it. They support research to help find early detection methods and additional treatment options and things like that. But from a practical point of view, from a patient point of view, they also provide a lot of patient services and answer questions and help with clinical trial information. They just really do kind of the whole soup to nuts service that a person or a caregiver or a family member would need. I also do some volunteer work for the organization on the advocacy front. So I'm the volunteer chair for the advocacy committee for the New York City affiliate. So we, work together to contact our congressional delegation to advocate for federal funding for cancer research and for pancreatic cancer research specifically. So really great group that provides a lot of services. Highly recommend people check it out.
And again, that address very simply is PanCan, PANCAN.org. Now, I want to get back to your journey, Rob, and that is that eventually it took a turn for the better. Could you describe when you felt like things were changing for the better? And again, be specific in how that manifested itself.
Yeah, so for me, I referenced earlier kind of the stress around not knowing whether or not I would be eligible for surgery. So as soon as I was cleared for surgery, knowing that I had a very tough road ahead of me, that in itself made a huge difference in everything, because I felt like I had a chance. I felt like I had more hope, knowing that I might be able to have the surgery. When the surgery did happen and I came through that, it was a very difficult initial recovery. That was expected, but pretty much everything from after the surgery on was all from a very positive perspective for me. I felt very optimistic about my chances at that point because the tumor had been removed. There was no sign of spread. They biopsied 19 lymph nodes, and there was no sign of local spread. That made me feel very good. And while the chemo, as we discussed, was certainly not a walk in the park, it was something that I knew had a time-bound aspect to it. And it would come, it would go, and it did. And that ended in November of 2022. So I've been out of official treatment now for about a year or so, a little over a year.
Our guest is Rob Caruano of New York City. And Rob, we want to wrap up by asking you this question. If pre-diagnosis, you could assess your health as 100% today, how close are you to 100%? And if you fall short of 100%, what is it that you cannot do?
I'm pretty much, I really am pretty much back to the way I was before. It took a long time to get here. I had lost a significant amount of weight and all of that, but I'm pretty much back to where I was. I have some residual neuropathy, but very minor, and it doesn't affect my life. So I have absolutely no complaints, and I'm happy first and foremost to be here, and I'm feeling pretty good.
Excellent. Rob, I want to thank you for your story, not only where it pertains specifically to your cancer journey, but to bring the attention of patient equity, how it can affect people across a number of different strata, and how it in some ways is not addressed and how it needs to be addressed, so that hopefully maybe 2, 3, 5 years from now, this is a subject that is either not a subject or it's less of a subject. So, Rob, thanks very much for being with us on Cancer Interviews.
Thanks for having me. It was great to talk to you.
And that'll wrap up this episode. And as we always say when we wrap up, if you are on a cancer journey or a loved one, you are not alone. There are people out there like Rob. There are organizations like PanCan that are out there that can help to ease your cancer journey. So until next time, we'll see you on down the road.